Destinies Part 1, The Empire of Solaris. Chapter 4, The Imperial Procession, Cassiopeia, capital of the 6th province of Rigel, the Solaris Empire, Anastasi, servitor. Everything was ready. The parade ground stood silent. 10,000 soldiers awaited the Imperial arrival. As one approached the military academy of Rigel, the first thing that struck the eye was the vast fan-shaped esplanade bordered by 3 grand avenues: the Avenue of Heroes, the Avenue of War, and the Avenue of Glory. Each converged toward the Gate of Honor, overflowing with gilded ornamentation and adorned with the solar seal of the Empire. It was there, at the threshold between the profane and the sacred, that the Empire revealed itself in all its splendor. Upon this esplanade stood the entire 33rd Legion in formation, commanded by Legatus Cassius Verentius. Once beyond the gate, one entered the true parade ground, a vast courtyard enclosed by the Academy's symmetrical buildings. 3 distinct sectors could be seen there: the cavalry building and its stables to the left, the medical corps to the right, and at the center the main building, leading toward the quarters of the officers, legionaries, archers, engineers, and artillerymen. Immense bronze doors opened into the grand hall. The ground itself was bare, perfectly paved, ready to host a parade of overwhelming grandeur. Like his comrades, Anastasi found himself torn between the crushing solemnity of the moment and an excitement he struggled to contain. Before him stretched the living strength of the province, cohorts of legionaries, archers, cavalrymen, all standing in flawless formation on either side of the central path. All along the human corridor of the outer parade ground stood the first cohort of the 33rd, 500 men commanded by Primus Commander Valerian. Beyond the Great Gate, upon the inner parade ground, this formation gave way to 400 Praetorian guards of the province. Finally, upon the 6 steps of the central building themselves stood the strong men of the province: tribunes, questors, prefects, cohort commanders, nearly 100 high dignitaries, frozen like statues. Behind them stood the 4 legati of Rigel, recognizable by their richly decorated armor. At their side stood the governor of the province, Lucian Vortum, wearing a ceremonial imperial purple toga embroidered with gold, and the city magistrate Calvus Drian, likewise clothed in purple. Together, they formed the summit of the province's civil and military hierarchy, occupying the upper landing of the staircase at the very entrance of the grand hall. Behind this central nucleus stood the province's 4 aquilifers, holding staffs crowned by the radiant sun, emblem of Solaris. At the edges of the formation, cornisons and signifers carried instruments and banners. The entire assembly formed a military mosaic of nearly 200 men. The officer cadets, future pillars of the empire, stood aligned behind the Praetorians of the left column, while the engineers and artillerymen stood behind those on the right. All at attention, straight backs, arms rigid, heads held high, motionless. Cosmus stared wide-eyed, fascinated by the cornisons and their many instruments. Magnus, rigid as a marble column, looked ready to face the emperor himself. "It isn't the imperial family we should have invited," Lysander quipped. "It's every rival nation," Anastase nodded. "It's true," he thought. With such a spectacle, 1,000 years of peace would be guaranteed. A messenger suddenly appeared at full gallop. 2 Praetorians moved to intercept him. One seized the reins, the other steadied the saddle. The message was delivered to the first tribune. Victor, who possessed a remarkable talent for lip-reading, whispered, "The procession has entered Cassiopeia. They'll be here in 30 minutes. The sun stood at its zenith, the air dry and tense. Then a distant rumble rose in the distance. Cheers, cries, roars from the crowd. The procession was entering the Avenue of War. Anastasi frowned. The 4,000 legionaries of the 32nd are going to struggle to hold the avenue's security cordon. The tension rose another degree. Magnus and Pancras became as rigid as sacred statues, Anastasi, trapped between these two human pillars, briefly broke posture. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "If either of you faints, I'll catch you. I swear it." A faint smile loosened the overly tense shoulders of his comrades. After 10 minutes, the procession finally began to appear. Every gaze turned toward the great gate one after another, as though drawn by the same invisible force. "This is it," Pancras let slip, he who almost never spoke. His deep, tense voice rang out like a battle order. He had not shouted, yet his words carried the weight of a centurion preparing his men to charge enemy cavalry. Then, in the distance, the vanguard appeared first, around 20 Praetorians of the Imperial Guard, the First Legion, the most prestigious military unit in the world. Their capes drifted lightly in the wind, their helmets and armor gleaming in pure white. Everything about them radiated martial perfection, unlike the Empire's other Praetorians, who wore imperial purple. These men were dressed entirely in white, a tradition unique to the First Legion, one of a kind, composed exclusively of the most fearsome warriors chosen from among the elite of the chosen, and sometimes even beyond them. Their helmets extended into white steel faces sculpted in an ancient style, reminiscent of the heroes of the first solar legions. Anastasi felt his heart beat faster. One day he too would wear the purple, when he became a legatus, and if the gods of Solaris granted him their favor, perhaps he would one day march beside the men of the First, clad in immaculate white. The rest of the procession, nearly 100 individuals, slowly entered the inner parade ground. Horsemen, imperial carriages, ceremonial chariots, and supply wagons advanced in perfect order behind the white-clad vanguard. The cornisons began the solemn hymn of Solaris, a powerful, martial, sacred music that filled the air like an ancient breath. For more than 3 minutes, the notes resonated, while members of the procession dismounted and the vanguard slowly spread apart to form a corridor of honor. Then, when the final note faded, silence fell all at once, almost religious. The gravelly voice of the first tribune rose sharply, cutting through the air like a blade. "Legionaries!" A brief silence. He waited until every eye was turned toward him. "Salute Solaris!" Then in one perfectly synchronized motion, the 1,000 soldiers upon the parade ground drew their swords with their right hand. Steel sang in unison in a shiver of metal. The blades were raised high toward the sky, arms fully extended, slightly inclined forward, as though seeking to capture the light of the sacred star. The imperial high dignitaries, some 20 men draped in richly embroidered cloaks, began their slow march toward the grand hall. Ascending the first steps of the academy as they passed, the soldiers continued the ritual salute. Second movement, the hand holding the sword slowly descended toward the left side of the chest, eyes lowered humbly before the greatness of the Empire. Third movement, once the dignitaries had passed, the swords were lowered toward the ground, their points angled downward, hands turned forward, fingers gripping the hilt with reverence. Only then did heads slowly rise again to stare straight ahead, toward the horizon, the future, duty. The silence was heavy, almost sacred. Nothing could be heard now but the muffled scraping of boots against the sand-dusted stone. 20 men, incarnations of power itself, made an entire army tremble through their mere procession. Cosmas, overwhelmed, whispered, "Look, it's the Aurelia imperial family. Little Prince Menander, Princess Emilia, and Demetrios Aurelia, the Grand Marshal," Anastasi breathed. "How do you know that?" Victor asked. No one bothered answering such a question. Lysander narrowed his eyes. "I can see legati from several provinces by the color of their crests." Magnus nodded. "Pure white for the First Legion, solar yellow for the solar lands, scarlet red for the 5th province of Antares." Victor looked bewildered. "How do you know all this?" Magnus smirked. "You planning on passing the helmet ceremony, dullard?" Pancras suddenly exclaimed, "There! One of the Empire's 4 marshals." Cosmas whispered, "Incredible." "So much gold," Magnus exhilarated. "Look! Aelios the Great." "Ah, yes. That's him," Victor said. Then, after a brief moment of thought, "He's a legatus," Magnus exploded. "Not at all." "What are you talking about?" "He's Imperial Guard, the only non-chosen ever admitted into it. The greatest warrior in the Empire. He's like us, born in the 5th province. He's responsible for protecting the little prince." Victor replied sarcastically, "Poor man, reduced to being a nanny." Magnus looked scandalized. "It's the highest honor imaginable." Behind this procession of glorified men followed 10 signifers, each bearing a banner, Solaris, the 8 provinces, and the coat of arms of the Aurelia dynasty. The cadets, clad only in simple tunics, saluted without weapons. Anastasi watched Demetrios ascend the steps and greet each host in turn. Then every member of the procession disappeared through the massive doors of the grand hall.